Next news as it happens. Next scheduled news at 11 o'clock over WOR, Radio 710, the Talk of New York. And here's Gene Shepard.
Yes, class is in session. Just a moment here while I get my little electronic dingies ready here. That was nice. Yes, indeed. I have here some exhibits that I'm going to put into the record here, if I may get the congressional record moving here. There we go. Hey, I just received a very important note here from a researcher who was working outside of Boston. And he said, I'm doing a paper, a research paper on American humorists. And he said, I would like to know whether you'll tell me what is the original inspiration. What caused you to become a humorist? Well, now that's a difficult question to ask. I mean, that's like writing Arthur Miller and say, what caused you to become a tragedian? But I can only say this, that I have to come. I'll weigh in with a theory about this, if you don't mind. Get a little theoretical here tonight. That I think all of us, at one time or another in our lives, are affected by stuff that our parents do. Now, that's a pretty much of a cliche, but I mean, I'm not talking about things that they do to you. I mean, things that they do. That's different. And so if your old man every Saturday night gets mad and runs out and eats at the McDonald's, says, the hell with you, I won't live with this crowd anymore, that's going to affect you after a while, you know. So you begin to relate Saturday night with running out and eating at the McDonald's. And that's what you do sometimes. Now, on the other hand, there are things which occur to you passively. Now, I've always admired guys who lived in a very straight life when they were a kid. I mean, that they grew up to be very straight, official people. You just can't imagine anything funny going on in, let's say, Richard Milhouse Nixon's house when he was growing up. I mean, I just can't, it just sounds, I have a feeling that was a very, very straight, square house. Now let's take what you could call peripheral influences. Now, if you're a kid, I bet there's a lot of kids that are growing up today who are not aware. You see, they think that their parents aren't affecting them at all because they're sitting up in the room there and they're sulking all the time. Not the parents, the kids. So a lot of kids do that. A lot of kids spend their time up in a room sulking, and I don't know, which it's one of the let's put it this way, one of the identifying characteristics of the breed of the kid. You can identify a kid because he sulks. So, just like you can identify a horse because he's got these 4 feet. And he goes, there's certain identifying characteristics. Well, you are affected, however, whether you like it or not, or know it or not, in peripheral ways by things that happen regularly around the house. Now, so there's a kid that's being affected by the fact that every Wednesday night his mother and his father squat in front of the TV set, eat Frito-Lays, and watch Cannon. Right? Okay. Now you think you're not affected because you're sitting up there being hip, You're sitting up there reading Mad Comics and listening to Shepard. But that doesn't you can't escape. That 40 years from now, you will have been affected by this Wednesday night Cannon syndrome, or We Never Miss Hawaii 5-0 syndrome. So it's part of your life, you see. So when I was a kid, my mother was not like other mothers. I didn't know it at the time. I mean, I just accepted it, and I didn't realize that things were different at home than they were in other kids' houses. For example, there was never any soap operas on in my house. My mother never listened to soap operas. She does not watch soap operas to this day on television. There are some people who need vicarious lives, and there are others who don't. My mother was not one of them. She was living in her own soap opera, so why the hell watch somebody else's, you know? So, no, I'm serious. She never watched soap operas, nor listened to soap operas. Okay, but what did come over the radio? Well, I never listened to this stuff. Now, remember, I was not listening. I would be going through, I would be, in the kitchen making a peanut butter sandwich or something, and fooling around, and going out. But all the time, this stuff was coming out. It's just drifting around. It's like music, you know. What did she listen to? Well, I'll tell you. She listened to, she was listening to a guy named Ransom Sherman. Did you ever hear of him? You haven't. That's right. Ransom Sherman is a legend. He really is a legend. And like many legends, one thing about legends is that they're not universally known. In short, how many of you, a lot of kids are growing up today who do not know about, let's say, the legend of Paul Bunyan. You'll buy that. And yet Paul Bunyan is a legend. Because you don't know about it doesn't make it so that he isn't a legend. That Ransom Sherman is a legend. Now, what was he a legend about? Well, Ransom Sherman was probably the first totally off-the-wall, surrealistic comic that ever worked in the mass medium. And he was the forerunner to much that came later, including much funnier, incidentally, in his heyday than Fred Allen, which is almost a sacrosanct thing to say. It's an evil thing to say. Like sacrilegious, I'm saying something, right? But he was a very funny man, and he was a legend. He was he was an underground comic. Now, if you can imagine a mother that goes out and secretly mainlines Lenny Bruce, that's going to be a different kind of mother than well, here was my mother sitting around listening to Ransom Sherman. Well, now, what kind of things did Ransom Sherman do? Well, he did many things, totally surrealistic. He had a place called, for one thing, he had this show, you see, it was on the radio, he had this show where he used to do a daily remote from a place he called Stedgy Prep. And they had an orchestra, the school orchestra would play the William Tell Overture. Sounded terrible. And my mother's laughing like hell. I couldn't figure out why she's laughing at this. It was a terrible band. It sounded exactly like the Morton School Band. But my mother was laughing, and I would come. The announcer was again Ransom Sherman. He'd say, "Good afternoon and welcome to our Education Now program from Stedgy Prep. Today we're going to interview Spike McBullet, the dynamic coach of the Stedgy Prep football team." And Spike came on, and Spike, let's put it this way, Spike was a totally light-footed coach. I mean, he had hair ribbons in his hair. It was funny as hell. My mother was laughing. Hey, I'm a kid. I know what she's laughing at. So, all right. Now that's the first influence. So I always thought of the radio as something that was funny. I never listened to any dramas or any of that kind of jazz, which apparently other people did. The only time I ever was involved with listening to the radio was Ransom Sherman. Vic and Sade was on all the time. Have you ever heard of Vic and Sade? You didn't. Well, Vic and Sade was, let's put it this way, it was a classical parody of the soap opera. Great classical parody. Vic and Sade and their son Rush, who was constantly reading a novel called Third Lieutenant Stanley Among the Aborigines. And he would begin by reading the novel and say, "Third Lieutenant Stanley said, 'Lady Margaret, I shall protect you from this wave of overwhelming savages which are about to attack. Stand back.'" And then he never finished the chapter. So that was that was another thing that I heard all the time. Now, when you're sitting there laughing at people called Bluetooth Johnson, Bluetooth Johnson, and Vic, by the way, was in a lodge called the Sacred Stars of the Milky Way, and he was the Sacred Big Dipper, and he worked at the Plant 14 of the Consolidated Kitchenware Corporation of Peoria, Illinois. Now, when you hear this kind of stuff, you don't take the kind of view of let's say the mass media as, say, a kid that is listening to Terry and the Pirates, who thinks of it in very stodgy terms. To me, that's very straight stuff. And, you know, now that is the only thing kind of... and, there was one other influence, too, that I must say influenced me strongly. My father had a bookcase, which was filled with books, strangely enough, which was a very unusual sight in our neighborhood. He had a book. In fact, it's a very unusual sight in many people's neighborhoods right to this day, friend. So don't laugh with that supercilious laugh. How many books have you bought lately, buddy? So, nevertheless, he had a bookcase full of books, and I used to sneak these books out and read them because they were there, you know. And the first book that I read was I remember reading it. It had a yellow cover, and this book really affected me. It was called The Claw of Fu Manchu. Now, he had a claw. See, I don't bother you with the plot. It was fantastic. But I do remember Fu Manchu sitting in his throne room. He had a throne room. And he had these deep sunken cheekbones. And he emanated a radiation like around him. He emanated the feeling that he was thousands of years old. And his eyes were yellow slits that glowed in the dark, and flickering lights of evil would play across them from time to time as he's talking to C. Nayland Smith, who was about to be fed to the man-eating mushrooms. Now, you know, I read this. Now, a lot of you kids grew up, I suppose, reading really serious literature, right? You sat down there and you were told by your parents that what you should read is Norman Mailer. There I was reading The Claw of Fu Manchu. Now, there was also another book that I read, which was in that same bookcase, which forever has influenced me. It was called After 1903, What? Now, who wrote that? That was written by Robert Benchley. And in his preface, it said the reason he called it that is because it sounded like an important title. He says, he says, you know, if you come on and you call your book a lot of funny stuff, or, you know, funny jokies, he says, nobody reviews it. It gets pushed at the back of the counter, and you get hidden down there with the Snoopy books, the cartoon books. So he says, if you have something called After 1903, What? Obviously, the New York Times is going to review this. It's a sociological tome. His next book was called David Copperfield, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He said that he wanted his books to sound like books. Now, I'm reading this, you see. This affected me strongly. This is WOR New York, friends. And you want to hear some of the other influences on my early childhood, right? Many of us have had a late childhood. In my case, it was early. I had an early childhood. Yes, I worried a great deal. By the time, from the time I was 6, I began to worry. But another influence at the other end of that, great list of books, there was a book called She by H. Rider Haggard. She. Now the premise of this book, it was later made into a movie. Now the premise of this book was that there was this 900-year-old lady. She was 900 years old, and she lived in a cave with a lot of other guys, and a lot of other. She was like the king or the queen or something there. See, she ran the whole show, and the hero fell madly in love with her. This 900-year-old, unbelievably looking great lady. She just looked great, and she was just fantastic, and he fell in love with her. Well, anyway, at the end, what happened was. Well, I don't want to burden you with the ramifications and the convolutions of the plot. It was a very complicated plot. But in the end, all of a sudden, she dissolved. She was in this cave where she was hermetically sealed or something, and so the air got in or some damn thing, and while he's in love with her, all of a sudden, right there in front of his eyes, she turns into this ancient crone. And then she got older and older. The next thing you know, she's 900 years old right there in front of him. And she's just a little pile of dust. Well, when you read this at the age of 8, you don't really look at life much the same, because I had felt for a long time that Miss Shields was at least 900 years old in our school there. I was expecting the wind to blow in one day, and she turned to dust. Well, now, these are the early influences. Had I lived in a family where the father read the Wall Street Journal and the mother listened to Mary Marlin, Backstage Wife, I probably would have grown up to be a very successful Metropolitan Life Insurance salesman. And later, I would write a book on how to sell insurance to your neighbors. And yes, or I would have gone on to become a moderately successful orthodontist. And I've always felt a little cheated that I did not live in that kind of a family. I seriously do. Now, on the other hand, I could tell you more and more about this, and I'm probably boring the hell out of you. So we'll bring you back to life here, buddy. Here's a commercial or two, or maybe 20 or 30. They'll inject a little spirit into your marrow. Bring them on there. Right, we're back again. Now, I can tell you, hey, speaking of influences, now I know I have a lot of documentary evidence on one important facet of what I guess you could call your life work, and that's this, that my work has influenced people. I know this. In fact, I keep getting letters from guys, who, like the other night, a great letter. I got a letter from a guy who was he was driving a truck. He started out, he says, I was driving my truck along towards Spartanburg, South Carolina, or is it North Carolina? South? Anyway, he says he was on his way to Spartanburg, and he said he was driving the truck, and he said he was a very literate, funny letter. Incidentally, he's a PhD in education, and he's driving this truck. I don't know why, but he is. It's a romantic life anyway. So he says, I was driving along, and he said, I was tuning across the radio dial in the truck, and he says, all of a sudden out came your voice, and he says, my God. He said, I realized that, what an unbelievable influence at this point that you've been on my life. And I realized this. I accept it. I realize that. And I realize that 25 years from now, there will be guys who will be telling their friends, trying to explain to them what this was. And just like I tried to explain Ransom Sherman to you, and you didn't know who he was. But his contribution was great. He affected practically all of American comics. Did you know that? Yes, that's right. Do you know that there are composers that affected, say, Stravinsky, that people hardly ever know about, but who Stravinsky looked upon as really the great geniuses? There were several. Now, so a guy like Ransom Sherman, you can't put him down because you don't know anything about him. He was a great seminal artist. He was one of the great background people in this business, a real comic. But now, on the other hand, I remember one show. He used to do a TV show. Did you ever see the Ransom Sherman television show? Well, he had a TV show. Came out of Chicago. Now, see, Sherman he made a mistake, I guess, in his career, if you want to call it that almost everything you do in this life is really not so much how well you do it. It's where you do it. And ball players can tell you this. There's many a mediocre ball player who is in the Hall of Fame today only because he played in New York. That had this same guy played out his career in, say, Pittsburgh or, say, a place like Kansas City. Who would have heard of him? But New York is where it is, And so, if you're going to be a shortstop, be one here. Do you realize how big Hank Aaron would have been had Hank Aaron played the last 20 years for the New York Yankees? I mean, seriously. But it's just a fact. So Sherman did all of his work out of Chicago. He didn't come to New York, nor did he go to Hollywood. He did his work out of Chicago, which was the wrong place to be for his field. And so, but nevertheless, this is the kind of influences you see all around you. Now, another influence on me when I was a kid. Other kids influence you strongly. And this is not taken into account much when people talk about artists. They'll say, you'll interview somebody like Norman Mailer, and you tend to think that he was only influenced by writers. Well, not necessarily. We're all influenced by millions of things. And some of the most critical influences, really critical influence, is often somebody that you can barely remember, but who puts you on attack. at one point. You know, a tack, a course. He steered you somewhere. Well, there was a kid. Now, I don't even remember this guy's name. Now, I'll tell you, at one point, there was a kid living in the neighborhood, in our neighborhood there, who was a different type of kid from all the other kids around there. Now, all the kids that I knew, they, you know, played ball, and we were very active types. You know, we played ball and football and all this stuff. Well, this guy moved across the street. He only lived there about a year and a half, 2 years. But there was a curious quality about him. He was like a true loner, you know, and we weren't used to loners around there. He was a loner, see. Now, you would think, oh, it must be really romantic to see him as James Dean or something like that. No, he was just a sort of a schlumpy kid that was a kind of a loner, and he was he was always down at the library. He was a reader, fantastic reader. Now, he was not the kind of reader that you're thinking of. Immediately, you're thinking of the little short guy with the thick glasses who was a studious type. No, this kid was hung on reading, not studying. Reading, that's different. Very big difference. So, at that point, I used to go to the library a lot for various other reasons, but the library was right down the street. Played a great role in my life. And I used to go down to the library, and this kid would be down there. And one day, I was sitting at this table looking at Boys Life, which was why I went to the library mostly. They had a subscription to it. And Popular Mechanics. I always took it out and look at Popular Mechanics, right? So I'm sitting there looking at Boys Life, and this guy is at the same table. See, and I knew him. His name was Johnny something. I don't remember the last name even. So he's sitting there, and he's really laughing, and he's laughing like hell. And I said, "What are you laughing at?" He says, he said, "I'm just laughing at this book." He was kind of never said much, and I said, "Well, what is it? Let me take a look at, what is it? What is it?" He didn't want to talk about it, because people who read are often a little embarrassed about the fact they do. So I said to him, "Well, what are you reading?" He says, "Well, here." He says, "Read it. It's really great." Well, he gave me a book. Now, I don't know why this caught me. It really caught me, man. I mean, I read this, I started to read it, and I started to laugh right away. And I read every conceivable thing I could lay my hands on by this guy. The book was called Leave It to Smith, spelled with a P. P-S-M-I-T-H. Leave It to Smith. And he was a student. This guy was a student, this Smith. And he was an English student. It was funny as hell. Well, I really dug it. And I'm going to take this point right now to, in a posthumous way, to salute the writer of this, who I think was one of the great users of the English language, who just recently died. Who was it? Well, I'll tell you, P.G. Wodehouse. Great user of the language. I wonder how many people know that he was also a great song lyricist. Did you know that he wrote one of the great classical all-time standards? You ever hear a tune called Bill? La-da-dee-dee-da-da-da-da-dee. Well, anyway, he wrote a fantastic collection of books. He must have written 200 books in his lifetime, and I think I read 240 of them. And Bertie Wooster and the Drones Club, Freddie Widgeon, and all the great characters. You've heard of Jeeves, the butler. Well, that was a P.G. Wodehouse character. And so this affected me really strongly, and I was always trying to make book reports in school. They'd give us book reports, see, and they'd give us what they called a approved reading list. Well, the stuff that was on the approved reading list was really zingy stuff. I mean, like Ivanhoe, The Last of the Mohegans. Boy, was that a boring bunch of nothing. I couldn't get past the third word of that. Yeah, there's some people who read this stuff and really like it. The Deer Slayer tales. Boy, was that ever boring. I couldn't stand this stuff. And others, they're really living through this stuff. They love it. So I was always trying to hand in a book review on Leave It to Jeeves. Well, it's almost impossible to put in a book review, unfortunately, on a humorist writer, because that's not considered a serious writer by the official Academy people, which is really sad and tragic, because some of the great writers, I mean truly the great writers of the past, have been essentially humorous. The great writers I'm talking about the first-rank writers, and I can tell you who they are. Voltaire. Funny as hell, Voltaire. Yeah, really. Jonathan Swift had a savage, wild humor in his work. I bet you couldn't make a book report when he was around. I mean, if you tried to review Jonathan Swift, try to review Gulliver's Travels, it's not a serious book, stop it. You would have to review Summa Logica or something by Thomas More. But that's the way it is, you see. So if your life is going in that direction all the way through, so I was always reading Jeeves. Then I started to read another guy who really got me going, even more, in fact, than P.G. Wodehouse. Was a writer named Stephen Laycock. Now you look him up, Leacock, Stephen Laycock. Stephen Laycock is a Canadian, and he was a Canadian historian, I believe, a very official academic type, but he didn't write history. He wrote these wildly funny essays and collections of books that I can't describe them. You just have to read them. Well, then I began to move out in the other directions, and here I am when all the other kids are reading stuff like Flash Gordon. I'm sitting there reading Thorne Smith. Well, I know who Thorne Smith is. Oh, you know who that is, for heaven's sakes. You've ever heard of Topper? Well, all right, he created Topper. Thorne Smith, of course, that was a very, let's put it this way, sterile version of Topper that appeared in television. But his stuff was unbelievably bawdy all the way through. Yeah, I remember one scene with Neptune. He had a thing called Nightlife of the Gods. One of his books was about all the Greek gods came back. Neptune and Mercury and that whole crowd. They were alive, They were coming back to Earth because things were going bad. They had to come back and straighten it all out, And so here's Neptune sitting on the bottom of a Miami Beach swimming pool with his trident. And he was sticking ladies in tender spots as they swam over him. When you read this kind of stuff, when the other kids are reading, like Captain Marvel, you're going to be another. I never read comic books. Comic books did not turn me on one bit. In fact, they bored me all the way. I suppose when you start reading things like Wodehouse, and you read things like H. Rider Haggard, and you read stuff like Benchley and Stephen Laycock, you're not about to get turned on by Marvel at all. It never did it to me. I was always bored by comic books. Now, does that show a lack in me or not? Well, everybody's supposed to. I always see Joel Siegel on TV, and Joel Siegel is always pretending that he liked comic books. That's kind of sad. But which is worse, he seems to still like them, which is even sadder. But nevertheless, I never was turned on to that. I never listened to the radio much either as a kid. Never. To me, that was boring. And I was into reading. And if I did anything that was remotely connected with radio, I used to listen to an early show. This is when I was a little kid. There was a show that was on, the one show that I never missed as a kid. Now, how do you like that? I did listen to the radio. And you'll never guess what. I've often talked to the guy that did it. He's a friend of mine now. And we used to, I talk to him about it a great deal whenever I see him. And it was called, well, all right, it was a show that was done by Stud Terkel. Stud Terkel, you know who Stud Terkel is. Well, Stud Terkel had a show called The Wax Museum. And he used to do it in dialect, where he did these operas. And he'd be on for 1 hour, and it was like, if you can imagine, let's say Lucky Luciano, some tough gangster, is telling you what Don Giovanni is about. He would say, and then this doll comes out on the stage, and she starts singing this aria, see, and she's singing to the Duke. I really thought it was great. Now, I thought that was very funny. Now, I thought it was an extremely funny show. It was the only thing I ever really honestly listened to that I can say that I listened to on the radio. Now, when it comes to listening to, did you sit and listen to the Lone Ranger? No. That to me was kind of I guess even at that age I thought it was greasy kid stuff. It was not in my orbit. But when it comes to of course, I suppose when you get into other influences, you have to get even further than that. For one thing, I used to really like single panel cartoons. I loved cartoons. Now, not cartoon strips. A single panel cartoon, like the kind you see in the New Yorker. I love those. I really dug that stuff. And there was one cartoonist I really enjoyed when I was a kid. A cartoonist named Cobean. Cobean. Cobean, in a sense, was the forerunner to Gay and Wilson. He was a cartoonist of curious, sardonic humor. Speaking of sardonic humor, how about a couple of commercials? Right. So have I answered any questions? What is your influence? Well, nobody knows. Have you ever really stopped to think what caused you to be the way you are? I mean, what were your... It isn't just artists that have influences, let's face it. What drove you to become the top checkout man at the A&P? I mean, at what point did you there have to be influences, in your mind. And I don't know where this kid ever went. They moved out, and this kid had forever turned me onto what could be called literature of humor. So I always thought of literature as primarily something that is sardonic and funny. To me, and people who try to be funny in their writing often leave me very cold. For example, I'm bored right out of my skull by, Kurt Vonnegut. Bores me totally. Now, I know I've said a terrible thing to all of you, but I think he's a passing fad, and I think he's a fraud. Not a phony, but a fraud. I think he's fraudulent in the sense that his literature seems better than it is at this time in history. There always were that type. Do I find Philip Roth funny? No, I find him very sad. I don't find him funny at all. There are writers I find funny. Mordecai Ricklet, for example, I find funny. Who is he? Well, he's another one of those. So where it sticks, you never know. What influences people, you'll never understand, and where it starts, no one knows. I can only say though that a lot of things that are happening in your life, if you happen to be a kid right now, and there are a lot of kids who listen, if you happen to be a kid right now, there's a lot of stuff that's happening to you that you don't pay any attention to. That 20 years from now is going to be an operative factor in your life. I mean, both for good or for not good, who knows? But the operative factors are rarely the ones that Freud defined, I think, ultimately, because he was in another age. The factors that define the Freudian world were, in many cases, not even existent today. But, who was Mordecai Rickler? Well, he's a pretty good writer. Who was P.G. Wodehouse? Probably one of the great wordsmiths of all time. I'll tell you another guy that influenced me when I was a kid. I remember picking up another collection of his work, and I was so fantastically thrilled when I first met him. And then to find out that he reads my stuff was really a great thrill. Was S.J. Perelman. Another one. Perelman has a sardonic... Now, I would have to say that the next writer that probably influenced me more than any of the others all put together in one specific style was a guy who wrote a novel called The Dream Life of Balso Snell. He also wrote something you probably know even better, The Day of the Locust. Right? Nathaniel West. But, all right, So everybody has his own darts and arrows and slings of unkind fate. It's how you bend with them that counts. This is WOR New York. Stay tuned for In Conversation.